Hey everyone, welcome to night 2 of our backend section of full stack web development. So on Tuesday, we explored the basics of servers. We talked, there was a lot of housekeeping, as there often is. On the very first lecture, we talked about kind of what is the backend, what role does it play, what is Node, what is Express, and then we spent some time setting up our first Express server. And as you guys learned, a server in and of itself, at least when Express is in use, is extremely simple. It's just a couple lines of code and you're spun up and running. But of course, that's just the beginning. And there's a lot of fun stuff for us to explore both tonight and in the weeks to come. So tonight is very much a build off where we left off. Last time we looked at GET requests, and tonight we are going to be exploring some other requests. We're going to be exploring post, put, and delete, and also talking about a really useful tool that will allow us to test these other requests, Postman. And from what I hear from the PMs, a lot of you guys had a little preview of Postman. And if for some reason you are hearing about Postman for the first time and you haven't gone ahead and downloaded that, I would actually go ahead and do that right now, because we will be needing Postman for the lecture and definitely for your homework. So, just a little recap or just a little review of what we've learned so far. What can you guys tell me? And I love asking really ambiguous, open-ended questions. So I'll start by saying, what can you tell me about a server? What can you tell me about the back end? And preferably something that you didn't know before Tuesday. And one note I want to say about communication via Slack. Tom has posted a questions thread. If you definitely want your question answered, I would post it in there, because that thread is going to be kind of the first go-to place for questions. That being said, definitely respond to me when I'm asking for questions and participation in the main Slack channel. And sometimes we'll catch questions in there, but if you really want those questions answered, stick with that questions thread. So what people learned, backend is actually fun. Backend is super fun, but then again, I'm biased. Node.js is a runtime environment. Just the kind of difference between Node and Express and what roles they play. I see a few more people typing. I'll give you guys a second to shoot out your answers. And while we are waiting for a couple more people to type, I have a second question for you. And this is a little bit of a stranger question, but related, which is, what don't you know about the back end? Where are your knowledge gaps? What still feels mysterious or unclear to you about it? What are you excited to learn about the back end? Why we would ever use query. Cores, yeah, cores is a great one. So core, we'll talk about cores more, I think next week. I'm trying to remember when that comes up, but essentially cores is one of the ways that we prevent just anyone from accessing your endpoints. Query versus body. That one is, I'm glad you bring that up, because we are going to talk about the difference between query and body tonight. Hashing, yeah, so hashing is related to authentication, and pretty much all things authentication are still mysterious at this point. How files are uploaded to the server. Awesome, so this is good. It's sometimes tough to know what you don't know because you don't know it. But honestly, one of the first steps to really understanding something or really getting into a learning mode is being aware where those knowledge gaps are. So you'll find me asking other strange questions like this. How does SQL fit in? That's another great question. There is this whole database section that we have this little DB file that's taking care of all of the mystery for us, but we're going to pretty soon here have to actually dive into that ourselves. And how does middleware work? That one's coming up soon. That one we will talk about a little bit tonight, but in detail on Monday. All right, so you guys already know a lot more about servers than you did a few days ago, but there's still a lot to learn, which is totally fine because we're still at the beginning of this journey. Not to mention that that's one of the horrible and wonderful things about coding, right? Is no matter how much you know, there's always a million other things that you don't know. We must embrace the unknown to be successful coders. All right, so let's, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. We'll kind of do a little hands-on review of what we worked on last week. I zipped and shared the files that I typed out, so if anyone is behind, you can always grab that so that we're all at the same starting point. So I'll do a little review of the code we worked on, and then we will dive into some of these other endpoints. All right. Okay, so let's talk about this. Let's talk about this database or this code base. So I have open right now the index.js file, and every server is going to have kind of a starting point. You've seen a similar thing happen on the front end, and usually it is called index.js. I've seen a few other things, but it's pretty standard that it's going to be called index.js, and this is where everything starts, really. And for now, we're still going to be just doing all our coding in this one file. But one thing we'll play with next week is figuring out how do we actually break our code off into chunks and put it into different files and allow those to communicate with each other, because we like clean modularized code. And once we start to get into complicated APIs with multiple resources, it gets messy. And just a little reminder about this term resource. This was something I just touched on briefly last time, and something we'll have a continued conversation about. But a resource is just, you could think of it as a thing you're storing in the database. So in the case of this code that we've been working with, our resource was a user. We're working with one resource, a user. But we might get into a more complex app where there are users, and users have posts, and posts have comments, and posts have shares, and posts have likes. In which case all those things would be separate resources and need separate endpoints. So we can start to imagine how awful it would be to try and store CRUD operations for all of those different things in one file. But for now, we will just stick with the one file model and be aware that index.js is where everything starts. A couple other things to keep in mind. We have our data folder, which contains our nifty DB file. That is required up here so that we can use our database methods to access the database. Of course, we have our command line, and that brings me to an important reminder, something we talked about a few times yesterday, which is in order to get this file running, in order to get our server spun up and listening, what do we have to do? Yarn server. Awesome. We have to start the server. And this command, yarn server, where does this thing come from? Is on any repository, is it always going to be yarn server that starts our server? Ah, I love this answer. Yarn quotes whatever it's set up for. Exactly. So yarn server is not a given. And in fact, I see someone bringing up yarn start. Start is a very common keyword. You'll see npm start or yarn start. And how do we know what the command is that we need to use? Well, it's going to be in our package.json. Where are you? So we have this script called server, and it's going to start, it's going to run that file using nodemon, which nodemon, yeah, we had this whole thing last time about pronunciation of this awful, awful word that stands for a wonderful, wonderful thing, which allows us to keep our server running. So yeah, we could, I love this. We could change it to Open Sesame. Let's do it. Don't try this at home, kids, or do. So now we've just changed our command to the rather more obnoxious command of yarn Open Sesame. Not like sesame seeds, but there you go. Cool. So whatever we want it to be, we can change that in our package.json file. So that is going to run this file. Let's do a little quick debriefing of what happens here. Required, this is new syntax now that we're in backend land. So instead of importing, we're going to be requiring. So we're just requiring Express. It's just a package. It's a pretty wonderful package, but we have to require it. It turns out that the thing that this package spits out is actually a function. And when you call this function, it gives you an object, which we could think of as being the server. So you call the Express function, it plops out a server, and then the server has all these awesome methods. We played with some of the, well, actually, we just played with one of the router methods, the get method. I bet you guys can guess what some of the other methods we'll be using tonight are. We set up 2 endpoints using this get method. And then there's the obligatory listen method. You always want this on your server at the end, in fact. Without this, the server is not listening. And there's a metaphor that actually my partner came up with this, which was, I thought was awesome because he's not a programmer. But we were talking about servers over lunch, which is what happens when you hang out with me, is we end up talking about servers. I'm like this all the time. And he said that you would think of it as like the server is the guy behind the counter. And I love this metaphor. So the front end, if you're thinking about a shop, the front end is like the customer. They walk in whenever they need something. But the server is the guy behind the counter. It's always waiting and available so that if someone needs something, it's there for a transaction. So that's like listening. It's like manning the counter so that if anyone comes by and is like, hey, I need some users, the server can be like, okay, cool, I can hook you up with some users or whatever resource it's requesting. Cool. So yeah, so that's a little summary of what we looked over last time. So let's move on to some other fun requests. And anything else I want to say? No, I think it's time for us to write a post. Let's do a post now. And I see someone mentioning the waiters and kitchen staff. I feel like the database is like the kitchen staff. Like the database, they're important, but you, the restaurant attendee, aren't going to see them. So it's like, if you think about a code base as being a restaurant, the client is like the people coming into the restaurant, and the API are the waiters, but then there's this whole kitchen staff, which is like the database and authentication. All right, enough metaphors. I could just come up with metaphors all day, but we have to actually talk about things. All right, so let's do some posts. So we've seen that we've been using the server.get method. So, and kind of a almost over obvious thing. What do you think the method we're going to use to create a post request is? Server.post, exactly. And I'll go ahead and spoil the surprise. We will also be using server.put and server.delete before the night is up. And so this method looks really similar to the get one. There's going to be 2 parameters. The first is the endpoint, and the second is our callback function. So what do you guys think are the parameters for this callback function? Rec and res, good old homies. And we will do API/users. Excuse me, for post. Okay, so post request. Let's start with this. What makes a post request different from a get request? We're feeling pretty good about get requests at this point. Post is going to be slightly more complicated. Can anyone tell me why? We are going to be adding data to the database. It's write versus read, absolutely. So awesome, data in the body of the request. So we'll get into exactly what that means in a minute, but on a basic level, we could think of it as we now need to get some data from the user. And we've already seen getting a little bit of info from the user. Remember, we played with parameters. So we were able to get an ID from the user that was just tucked into the actual endpoint. But now we want data. this could be something significantly more complex than just an ID. So we're going to have to deal with how do we get data from the user? And it's not too bad, but it's going to take a couple extra steps. We do have to get the data back to them. We have to deal with updating the database. And then from our perspective as developers, there's one other challenge, which is we can no longer use the browser to test this, right? If I go ahead and plug this endpoint on my, what port am I on? I'm on 4000. If I do localhost 4000 and plug in this endpoint, I'm just going to get my GET request back. So life just got a little harder from our perspective as developers because we need a better way to test this code we're writing. And that's where Postman is going to come in. So we're going to write this, we're going to write a few bits of logic in here, and then we're going to have to bust out Postman so that we can see what's really going on. All right, so let's start with this rec body business. So there is a body, a request body, and that's essentially the place that the data lives, the data that the user is sending lives, or the client. So we could, I'll even steal some code that's already appearing in Slack. This is great. You guys can just Slack me the code and I'll just plug it in and my job is going to be super easy. And I'll just come up with metaphors and everyone wins. So yeah, we could do that. So body lives on rec, on the request. Remember, the difference between rec and res is the request handles everything that's coming in and the response handles everything that's going back out. So this data, whatever they want posted to the database, is going to, of course, be on our request. So we could go ahead and grab this user data. And then we need a database method. So remember our friend the database, there's some useful methods in there. Which one of these do we want? db.insert, absolutely. db.insert. And then we know that there's going to be a .then and a .catch. And presumably we'll send some things. So as far as this, could we do, well, actually this syntax probably won't work because this is looking for a user on rec.body. And usually what we're gonna see actually is that the properties are straight up on here. So we might say if a user has, I think it's a name and a bio, we'd actually see something more like, want something more like this. Wait, is that working? I think I'm getting that syntax wrong. Let's just do that. I'm trying to remember how this comes in, but I'm pretty sure that this actually is what we want. We'll see it. We will confirm if this is correct in a moment. Okay, so the user is going to, the keys of the user will actually be directly on the body. It won't be a property on the body, which is why we want this syntax. So, and I really like the suggestion, which is we should just console log this user from the get-go. We want to make sure that this user is what we think it is. So best way to be sure of that is just throw a console log in. All right, probably want to insert the user. And what is going to go in our then and our catch? So we'll get to that user in a minute. Let's deal with the then and the catch for a moment. Well, let's start with our then. What do we want to do in our then? So we have this suggestion. Which is that we then res.json, no, we do not release events. Our user, okay. And then let's throw something in our catch. There's a ton of stuff I want to talk about within all this, but let's go ahead and take care of our catch real quick. And then we'll break everything we just did down. What do you think should happen in this catch? Give you a hint. We could probably just almost directly steal the code from up here. So we want a slightly different message, but so failed to insert user in DB. Cool. Okay, so let's talk about everything that just happened. So we tried to pull this user off rec.body. There was a brilliant suggestion that we should probably console log this to make sure that this thing is actually a user, as we hope it is. We then used db.insert, we put the user in. And then we made an assumption. And I'm excited to talk about this because we're going to take a little side journey into something that came up for, I know, a few different students in the homework. So what assumption have we made in this code, in this little chunk of code right here? No, that's kind of an open-ended question. If anyone can catch it, awesome. That the response is in fact a user. We made an assumption that db.insert, that this promise resolves to a user. We don't know that that's true. That would be nice. That seems fairly sensible, but we don't know that. And the reason I said that this is going to take me on a little side tangent is I want to talk about something that I know came up for a couple of you. So let's scroll on up to our get by ID up here. So we did this db.findById, and we tinkered around on Tuesday, and we found out that this promise does in fact resolve to a user, right? It's a user object, so we were able to check if it exists, and we were able to return it or send a 404 response if we got undefined back, and that worked awesome. And then you guys went to the homework, and there was a very similar problem you had to solve on the homework. It was a very similar endpoint, and there was a db.findById, but I know some of you guys discovered that that promise resolved to something different, an array. So in this case, the findById method resolved to an object. In the case of the homework, the seemingly same method actually resolved to an array. And both are sensible choices. It's just a different design choice. And I was kind of curious about this, and I even tinkered around and saw that findById calls a method called .first, which I know returns an object. And if we go up here, we see that this uses a where method, which actually happens to return an array. Now, I don't expect you guys to know that where turns an array and that first returns an object. I wouldn't expect you to know that offhand. But what I do expect you to do is to ask questions and to not assume, and to console log, and to be sure that the thing you think you're working with is actually the thing you are. So on that note, we're gonna go back down here, and we're actually going to, so we'll say user from body, and then let's go ahead and put another console log in here that says user from insert method. So we're actually going to get two different console logs here, and this will help us find out if these users are what we think they are. Really good practice. And then down here in our catch, I think everything's looking pretty good. Status 500, kind of a catch-all error status, and then JSON. And can anyone, speaking of statuses, can anyone tell me why, on this line of code, on line 48, why are we not setting a status? Why is it that down here on the catch we're setting a status, but up here we seem to be skipping it? Implied for 200. 200 is the default. Both correct, yeah. So Express and all its magical magicness will just assume that you mean a 200 if you don't set the status. So what that means is that we can skip writing .status, but that doesn't mean that we, the developers, can skip thinking about the status. Every time we call res.json or res.send, always ask yourself, what status do I want? If the answer is 200, you can skip it. But if you get in the default of skipping it, you're going to end up getting 200s when there's actually errors. So yeah. All right, and then, okay. And then is there anything else I wanted to say about this? I think we're good. I think we're mostly good. Let me catch up on any questions that are coming up so far. How come no curly brackets around user? So that's a good question. And I'll go ahead and just talk about that for a minute. So essentially, if the data shape, if rec was equal to an object that contains a body, that contains a user, okay, so we're a few layers deep here. And it might be easier if we were just talking about rec. So essentially what we'd be saying is, if we put the brackets around, is that we're looking for a property called user on body. When we remove the brackets, we're saying just whatever body is, store that in user. So let's say that body, what we think is that body is going to be set equal to something like this. How do you spell extraordinaire? I shouldn't try to spell difficult things while on camera. All right, there we go. So notice that in this case, the shape of the data is that body is actually set equal to what's essentially a user object. So that's what we're going to expect to see, is that this body will actually be a user object. So all we have to do is take whatever lives in rec.body and store it, give it a new name. And we wouldn't even have to do this. If we wanted to, we could just plop rec.body directly in here. But it's going to be, I think, clearer. This brings back this idea that I mentioned briefly on Tuesday, that we're writing code for developers, not for computers. Even though plopping rec.body directly in insert from the computer's perspective is exactly the same, to a developer, it's much clearer that this is supposed to be a user when I actually name it user. And then I have another question that came up that said, can we talk about what's happening in here? I know we kind of already did. If there's any more specific questions about what's happening in this chunk of code, feel free to ask. All right. So let's go ahead and, oh, where did my console log for user go? Okay. So let's go ahead and actually test out this code. We've made a couple assumptions in writing it, so we were going to be interested to see what happens when we actually run it through. So now it's time to bust out Postman. Postman. There it is. All right, let me kind of squish this a little bit so we can see our code and our Postman at the same time. Yeah, that's kind of hard to see. This might be a losing battle. All right. Hopefully I haven't just created more confusion here. Let's just make sure we can at least see our terminal. Okay, so we see our terminal and we can see Postman. All right, so Postman is a tool for sending requests. So it'll just allow us to send requests to servers, including localhost, which is awesome because we want to test out our localhost. So let's go ahead. We want to post, right? We want to practice posting. What is going to be our request URL? What request URL do we need to access this endpoint that we just wrote together? API.users, user, is it user or users? Users, yes. But yes, we're missing something. So this is the actual endpoint, but the full URL will need our localhost. So localhost 400, 4000, not 400. And then, all right, so we've done it. Let's go ahead and press send. Okay, we got failed to insert user in DB. So we know our catch is working. And we see a little log over here. So what went wrong? What went wrong here? Why did it error out? There's no user in the body, exactly. So we sent a post request, but we didn't actually tell the server what we want to create in the database. And notice that there's this little body thing here. And, oh, actually there is some random stuff here from me tinkering around earlier. So body, okay, this part is important. This is one of those things that it's easy to forget, and you will pull out your hair for half an hour trying to figure out what's going on. But it's, once you know what to do, it's super simple. So listen, what I'm trying to say is listen carefully, because if it's easy to forget this little step, but it will break everything if you do. So we're here in body, and then we need to select a couple things. So raw is good, but we don't want text. We want JSON. Cool. And a little reminder, JSON, I don't know how much you guys have talked about JSON already, but JSON is pretty much JavaScript objects, but plays by slightly different rules. Mostly just that we need to put everything in double quotes. So user, even the key, needs to be in double quotes. So we'll do user equals, I don't think we need a semicolon. Bio. And someone looked up extraordinaire for me. There we go. All right. Cool. So now we have some data. All right. And are we ready to send? Anything else? Should we just go for it? Let's pull the trigger. Uh-oh. Is it name? Yeah, oh, I think it is name. And by the way, if you're super forgetful like me, where could I look to find what my data shape is supposed to be? I could run a GET request, actually a couple different awesome answers. I could run a GET request and see what comes up. I could also check the docs, the README. So let's just double check those, that README. It's kind of squished right now, but. User schema, name and bio. These other things will be created by the database itself. Okay, cool. So I think we got it, name, bio, but wait, it's still breaking. What's going on? What is going on? This is another one of those things that is easy to forget, but you will drive yourself insane trying to figure out why this isn't working. So it turns out, and I will say this is something that if you don't already know this, you really would have no way of getting it. This body, this rec.body, isn't automatically parsed for us. So it turns out that, remember, Express is super bare bones. It's super lightweight. It really only gives you the minimum you need. And within that, it actually will not parse the body for you. Express does not automatically take the body of the request and put it on this rec. So this rec.body thing that we're trying to use here is not a given in Express. You have to ask for it specifically. And I, in fact, already see one of you guys posting the code that we will need to do that. So one of you guys brought up body parser. There is a library called Body Parser. It will do this for you, but it turns out that Body Parser was just so commonly being used that they actually built the functionality of Body Parser into Express. So there is a Body Parser library that you could use, but there's an even easier way to do this. So let's talk about middleware for a second. Middleware, as a reminder, we mentioned it briefly on Tuesday. Middleware is what we use to make Express more robust. So it's this extremely simple, lightweight framework, but it has middleware built in, or capacity for middleware built in, which will allow us to make it do more and more interesting and complicated things. So there are a few different types of middleware, and we will talk at length about middleware on Monday. There's completely customized middleware. There's middleware that you might import from separate libraries. And there's middleware that is built straight onto Express. The most commonly used stuff is actually built straight onto Express, including the parsing capability that we need. So when you want to plug in middleware, make sure you plug it in above your endpoints, because whatever is above these will be read first. If we plug it in below the endpoints, it will be added after it's already too late. So we want to do something called server.use, and I always type user instead. It's like a lifelong problem I have. So server.use, and then we can plug our middleware directly in. So the middleware we need is, there is a method on Express called JSON. And JSON, what this method does, express.json, is it returns a bit of middleware that will go ahead and parse that body for us. So this method will return our middleware. We could, if we wanted to abstract this out, we could even say, we could even up here say something like, parser, and then plug this directly in. You'll usually see this in one line, but I actually like to separate it out to make it really clear what's going on. This method says, hey, I'd like to use some middleware. This method says, here's a piece of middleware. You put them together and voila. Let's see if it works. Whoa, okay, we're making progress. So we see that this user from body, this body object is a user. So we were right in kind of one of our assumptions there, which is that rec.body is in fact a user object. So this was the right line of code. We didn't want to wrap it in curly brackets. So we know that this thing is in fact a user. It's working now that we're parsing it correctly. So we're plopping the right thing into db.insert. So what, okay, so what else do we notice? What else, and I see someone's already mentioned this in the questions. I think we might be able to notice something else a little strange that's happening from one of our other console logs when we ran this. Yeah, so this thing that we called, we made a guess. We said, okay, maybe it's a user. It's not exactly a user. Or at least it's not a completed user. It only has one key, the ID. So, and there's a question, I really like this question actually. Why does insert only return the ID? There's no cosmic answer to that. It was a design choice by the database. It's the same as this why in one case did find by ID return an object, and in another case return an array. It's just how the developer who wrote the database decided to write it that way. So it doesn't matter too much what exactly we're getting back, what exactly this promise resolves to. It just matters that we know what it is so we can handle it correctly. So we maybe don't want to call this a user. It's not exactly, we could call it, you know, an ID info object. So now when we run this, we see that we get back, and now we've inserted Cheryl's, our philosopher friends, into the database twice. So we got back a slightly different ID object. If we wanted to confirm that, oh yeah, one other issue. So we talked about this defaulting to 200. 200 means okay, which is not the worst status code for this, but there is actually a slightly better status code when we're doing posts, and that's 201. So 201 signifies that something has actually been added to a database, or something's been modified, I believe. We can check exactly. Status 201. Created, yeah, so implies something has been created in our database. So that is a slightly better status code for what we're trying to do here. Where'd Postman go? There you are. Cool. So we have headers. Looking good. And we see that if we do it one more time, we get back 201 created now. All right, so what else? Oh, here's a good question. How do we know for sure that these things have actually been added to our database? So it's reason would lead us to think / hope that they are, but how would we be certain that these things are actually in our database? And I'll give you a little hint. We can use something we've already created to double check. A GET request. So we could do just a general GET. And we see that Charles is now in there 3 times. If we wanted to double check on one entry, we could always do a GET by ID. Awesome. All right. Okay, so I am going to take a little minute here to let you guys catch up. I meant to say this earlier. I know I said this on Tuesday, but as far as coding along goes, literally trying to type what I'm typing as I'm typing is maybe not the best way to learn. So what I encourage you to do is to, while I'm typing and I'm coding and I'm explaining, to more be watching, and then I'll give you a minute to catch up. So that's what we're going to do now. I'll answer some questions while we do that. And here is my post code. All right, I see a question. I'm getting a blank object back from Postman, user from body. So if you could slightly clarify, is it that is your request going through okay, but Postman is returning a blank? Or are you having trouble, do you not even see the user data on rec.body? So are you able to actually get a 200 or 201 on the request, or is it that something's going wrong in the middle? Okay, so the post request, it sounds like the post request is going through, but you're probably getting a 500 and failed to insert user in database. So what I would start by doing is console logging your rec.body. So make sure you're console logging your rec.body. If this is empty, one of 2 things are going on. One is that you might have not, or maybe both. One thing that's important is that you use this parser. And I'll actually go ahead and refactor this to look the way that you would more commonly see it. So if you're not using this middleware, you're definitely not going to be able to process this post request correctly. So that would be the first place I'd check. The second thing I would check is over in Postman, I would go over to your body, make sure that you've filled out a actual user in the body, and make sure that this is set to raw, and make sure that this dropdown is set to JSON. So if these things are not set correctly, it means that the body isn't actually being sent out by the client correctly. If this middleware is missing, it means that the body is being sent by the client correctly, but that it's not being parsed by Express correctly. So those are my 2 best guesses as to what might be going wrong. If both of those are in place and you're still having an issue, let me know and we can dig deeper. Is it possible that the URL is incorrect in one of the 2 locations? In general, it's possible. If you're receiving this error message, then I'm pretty sure you have the right URL. So if you're receiving the error message that we custom wrote in, then we know you're at least hitting this endpoint. But if something stranger is going wrong, it is possible that the endpoints do not match. Can we use ternary in Express? Yeah, absolutely.
Why is your shirt wet?
Someone needs to mute. Someone with a child needs to mute. Probably little child hands on keyboards, unmuting. I had a ferret who used to do that, but it's probably good I don't have a ferret anymore. It would be very disruptive to trying to teach how to build a server. And there was a question about ternary. For anyone who does not know what a ternary is, it's basically just a short and easy way to write an if-else statement. I would recommend looking it up. It's a nice little time saver. Ferrets do make great servers, but they get very jealous when they see someone else making a server, so they aim to sabotage. Ferrets' dispositions tend to be chaotic neutral, for reference. And yes, I think that building servers with ferrets could be an extremely successful YouTube channel that would probably violate my contract with Lambda School. All right, so we're talking about, all right, we're talking about ferrets and D&D alignments. I think it's maybe time for us to move on with the lecture. All right, cool. And thanks for that link to ternary expressions. Not necessary for what we're doing, just a good general JavaScript-y thing to know about. Okay, and one more question that I'm seeing. Why did I change the name of, why did I change this parameter to ID info instead of user? Excuse me. The reason I changed this is because it being called user implied that all the user data would be there. Things like the bio and the name. But as we discovered, is there, no, there's no console log here. Let me add this back in. All right. Uh-oh, what happened? I don't know, something happened. I think I sent it while my server was still restarting for my changes. That'll happen sometimes. So we see that the ID info is not a full user. It's just an ID. So I wanted to make that clear because I don't want us thinking that what we're getting back is a full-scale user when it's just the ID. All right, so and that actually brings me to my next point. So getting the ID back is nice and all, but it would be better if we got the entire user back, all that information. And in fact, if we look at the README, I believe that's exactly what it wants. So if we go down to the post requirements, it says it returns the newly created user. Uh-oh, here I go again. All right, so how would we send back the user instead of just this ID info? Cool. So there are a couple ways to do this. There's kind of the hacky way, which I will mention briefly, but it's not how we want to do it. We have this user thing up here. Couldn't we just return that? Bad practice. So why, if I just said, oh, we have this user from before, let's just return that. Why would this bit of code be bad practice? One answer is it doesn't have all keys and values, right? There's going to be these timestamps added. We don't have these timestamps yet. But even if that weren't the case, we want to make sure that what our client is getting back matches what's in the database. And in order to guarantee that, we probably should query the database again. So what we would actually want to do is do another DB, find by ID. And we could dot then, oh, this is getting messy. And we know that find by ID does in fact return a user. So we could do ID info.id. Okay, so I know I just kind of did like some blah, blah, blah. Let's see what I just added. So I inserted the user, which returned the ID info object. And then I actually called a second database method. And I passed the ID in. And then I was able to get the full user object back. So let's check and see if this works. Let's create a new user. There we go. Okay, so we have a new user. And look at that, we're getting the ID, name, bio, and these timestamps. Awesome, that is more like it. A quick question, why on this database call, why didn't I put a catch? Anyone know? So I did this other DB method, which returns a promise, and then I added a .then, which is good, but I did not add a .catch to this little chunk of code. Anyone either know why or can guess why? And it's not because I'm lazy. I am lazy, but that's not why I did this in this particular case. So the reason is, I mean, we can be hopefully pretty sure, hopefully, that this is going to work since the database literally just gave us the ID, but who knows, something might go wrong with the DB. It turns out, though, that this second catch should catch anything that goes wrong here. So this catch will catch everything contained within this chunk of code. So we should be fine. Even if this find by ID fails, this catch will handle it. Or maybe I'm lazy, who knows? Okay, so looking good so far. Are we done with the post code though? Do we feel totally happy with this? I'll give you a hint, it's not done. So can anyone tell me what is wrong with this code? And this is pretty subtle actually, so I'm gonna be impressed. We need to check the data that we're sending to the DB. So we've just assumed that this rec.body is going to be a user just like we want. And everything is going to work out great. We do not like to assume that our clients will send us what we expect. In fact, we should assume them to send us the most chaotic, obnoxious, unexpected things because they will find a way to break our code. It's like they're plotting against us. Yes, nulls and spaces. Exactly. And a combination of numbers that are in string form and number form. And possibly even SQL injections. We're not going to be worrying about SQL injections just yet, though. That is a real concern. For now, we just want to make sure that there is actually this name and this body, or this name and this bio field. And so some of this will be enforced by the schema of the database, but we don't even really need to worry about this. And if we look at the requirements for this project, it actually wants to make sure that this user has both a body and has both a name and a bio. So both are required by our API. So how do we make sure, and don't overthink this one, how do we make sure, or how do we handle a case where our client is missing one of these? An if-else statement, exactly. I know as we get more and more into the weeds of JavaScript, it's easy to forget the fundamentals. But yes, all we need is an if-else statement. So we're going to do if user.name and user.bio. If both of those exist, then let's go ahead and run this code we just wrote. Else. Anyone know what status we might want to send here? We'll just do a 400. So 400 means bad request. So very quick and dirty difference between 400 and 500 is 500 is more like something went wrong. Maybe it was you, maybe it was us. We don't really know. 400 is like you screwed up. It's the blame code. It's like we know for a fact that this is your fault. So if you want this, make your request better. It wouldn't be a 404 not found because 404 is for when our client is looking for something in the database and that thing does not exist. So in this case, in a post, you wouldn't really have a 404 because they're not looking for anything. They're trying to create something. So let's test this out. Let's make sure this works. So if they send Brillo instead of bio. Sure enough, we got a 400 and a message missing name or bio. So that way me, the client, can go, oh, I guess this was supposed to be bio. Or if I left this off altogether, I'd be able to see, oh, I guess the bio wasn't optional. All right. So the last thing I want to say about this last little piece where we confirmed that user name and user bio both exist, this is the tip of the iceberg. So, this kind of technique whispers at a really big piece of building servers, which is the idea of authentication. And this is what we've just done could hardly even be called authentication because we're really just making sure the data shape they're sending us is correct, but it's the same kind of thinking that we need. So we really, especially as we get into the auth section, we're going to start to think about who should be able to access this endpoint. What should they send us? How are they going to prove that they have access to this? So this is, I think, just kind of like a little hint of what's to come in terms of that it is our job to be scrupulous as the server. And like going back to this idea of the counter, of like we're the person manning the counter. It's like anyone can walk in the store, right? Like anyone can walk in the store, but it's our job to say, hey, you don't have any money, or you're being a jerk, or you're not wearing shoes or shirts, so we're going to refuse you service. So anyone can try to access our endpoints. We don't have control over that, but we have control over what we say. We can say no. We're the gatekeepers. And sometimes it's as simple as because you didn't give us the bio key and we wanted it. Sometimes it's very serious if we're writing, bank account software. So that is one thing to conceptualize, that you as the server, you as the backend developer, it's your job to be the gatekeeper to the database. Why did I put a if statement around this whole section? So this whole section is based off of this first database query, db.insert_user. So I do not even want to try to insert the user if it's not correct. So it actually turns out that based on the way this server is set up, that this code would have worked from the database's perspective. This code would have worked and run just fine had the bio been missing. So if the bio were missing, it would have inserted. But from the API perspective, we don't want that. We only want data to get in if it has both fields. So we do not want any piece of this code to run. we don't want a db.insert to run unless we know for sure that it's good. And there are two reasons for that. The first reason is that we don't want an entry ending up in our database that just has a name. The second reason is that if the data is totally wrong, we want to be able to give it this slightly more specific error message rather than this generalized one. So splitting this up into two categories accomplishes two goals. One, it prevents incomplete data from ending up in our database. Two, it's an added layer of assurance that our user will get a slightly more specific message if it so happens that the reason their request failed is that they were missing the name and bio. All right. Well, I think that is about time for us to take a break. So I'll go ahead and start a 5-minute timer. I'll answer any questions you guys have in the midst of the break. And then after we're done, we can do our delete and our put. So questions about the ferret. I actually had 2 ferrets. It was like when I was a teenager. I always wanted a ferret. I don't know. When I was like in 4th grade, this guy in my brother's class brought in his pet ferrets. And I was like, this thing is like the coolest thing in the world. It's just like as spazzy as a dog, but as like clever as a cat. So I always really wanted a ferret. And after like 4 years of begging, my mom finally bought me a ferret, which was a mistake because she ended up taking care of the ferret. I've learned that I shouldn't have pets. I'm a really good, like, you have a pet and I'm your roommate. And sometimes I like take your dog for a walk or something, or like I'm your friend and I cat sit for you sometimes person, but I'm not someone you want caretaking animals on any sort of long-term scale. So no more. And yes, ferrets are especially difficult because you can't just keep them in a cage. They can like sleep in a cage, but they need to be out and running around, but they will like destroy everything. My ferret was a Beanie Baby herder. Like I had this old collection of Beanie Babies in the basement and the ferret found it. And like you would find Beanie Babies in these strange places and you would see the ferret trotting by with like its mouth around the neck of a Beanie Baby. They are pretty cute though. They also, another fact about ferrets is that biting is one of the ways they show affection. So be prepared, not like super hard, but be prepared to be nibbled on if you have a ferret. Another, I think my mom's way of getting revenge on me for her having to take care of my ferret when I was in high school is that if I wouldn't like wake up for school, she would just put the ferret loose in my room and it would chew on me until I gave it attention, which it turns out setting a ferret on someone is a really good way to get them to wake up when they don't want to. Request to see the person code. It's just this one line here. I'll even just post this into the Slack so that everyone else can see the rest of it. Yeah, I think that's smart to add that into tonight's assignment in advance. I have to admit, I hadn't built a server in a minute before prepping for this class, and I totally forgot to put it in. And I was like, when I was going through the homework for the first time, like a month ago, and I was like, why? I don't understand. Why is my body undefined? And then I was like, oh my God, I can't believe I forgot about parsing. Yes, and the related easy to forget aggregating issue is make sure that your body is set to JSON. And this one's easier to catch, but no single quotes. I say it's easier to catch because Postman will actually, if you leave off the quotes or put single quotes, Postman will give you a little orange X to let you know that something's wrong. Oh, there's the timer. All right. I see an error, cannot find module connects. Have you done the yarn command to install all your dependencies? So if you've run yarn and everything's installed and you're still seeing cannot find module blank, maybe it accidentally got deleted from your package JSON. So for example, connects is in my package.json under dependencies. So if that's there and it says cannot find it, it means you have to install. If this is missing for some reason, it means you have to add it. It should be there. It was already there when you got it, but I know how things go. You're debugging and somehow you accidentally delete something you're not supposed to on a file you shouldn't. So hopefully that fixes your connects issue. All right, let's move on to a delete request. All right, where is our starting point for a delete request or for a delete route handler? Server.deletes. Awesome. And what is the endpoint going to look like for this? You know, our second parameter is going to be the homies. What is our endpoint here? API dot, I see posts, almost. I think you're thinking of your homework. Users as a resource. And ID, absolutely. So generally speaking, we probably don't want to have an endpoint that just deletes everything. And if you look at the requirements for this API, it is ID specific. So we are deleting individual users based on their ID. And can anyone remind me, what is this thing called? What's this guy? Parameter, yes. So we already saw that. And how can we access that? Where do our params live? Start to rec.params, yeah. And even if you couldn't remember exactly what this key was called, we could be pretty well assured it's going to be on rec, because anything that's coming from the client is going to be attached to rec. So we saw that body was attached to rec, ID, which is parameter, which is different than a body, but a different way to receive info, is also going to be on rec. Okay, cool. So what are we going to do with this ID? Delete. Yes, we will delete. I think we probably want a database method. That's usually db.remove. So the database method is called remove, and it accepts an ID. And this is one of those things that is not given. Maybe it wants the ID in an object, or maybe it wants an ID. You would have to check what this is expecting to make sure it's coming in the form. Okay, so we It's going to be a then and a catch. We'll start with our catch. Our catch is kind of doing some horrible, horrible copying and pasting here. Our catches are looking very similar to each other. So we'll change this message to failed to delete user. Okay. Then is slightly more interesting. So what does this db.removeID resolve to? And as far as actually, I really like this comment that just came up, which is, can we make a catch variable to make this more dry? We can't make a catch variable, but we could make honestly, the best way to do this, which would be, I think I will not spend too much time on because it could get really confusing, because we could come up with a default message, in which case we could just plug the same function into all of our catches. But if we wanted to make the message customized, we would have to actually do what's called currying, which would create a function that when you pass in a message creates another function. So I would actually do that if I were refactoring this code, is create a function that returns a callback for catch. And in that way we'd save some time. But for right now and for learning, I think it's better to just have everything separated out. All right, so back to our then. So there's some sort of resolution happening here. We could maybe figure it out if we looked at the docs, which is totally valid. But we can also just console log it. That's not a bad way to go. But let's actually look at the docs here. So we go down to remove. It returns the number of records deleted. That is good to know, because if we assumed it returns the deleted user, we would be wrong. So it's actually going to return a count, count of records deleted. So we can change this thing to count. So what do we want to do here? So yes, we would hope this is either 0 or 1. If it's more than 1, something has gone wrong with our database method, but we will assume we're either going to get 0 or 1. So what do we want to do? What different cases should we handle here? And I will say we could check the docs to confirm this, but I will just tell you right now that delete actually wants us to send back the user, not just the count. So we could do res.json count, but that's not how we want our API to work. We actually want to send back the user we deleted. And what's more, we really should create 2 different cases. So if count, and remember, because of truthy and falsiness, this will resolve to true. If count is 1 or more, it'll resolve to false otherwise. So in this if statement, we know something's been returned or something's been deleted. And we want to send back the user. Down here in the else land, we can make a pretty good assumption about what went wrong. If we hit this point, if count was 0, what do you think might have gone wrong? Why do you think that happened? Assuming that our database method is working the way. The item is already deleted, or maybe it never existed. And as summed up even better, bad ID. There was no user that matched the ID. Cool, so that is a scenario, kind of like up here where we said missing name or bio. That's the scenario where we can send back a slightly more specific error message. So this would be another situation where we probably want a 400, or actually a 404. Because in this case, we didn't find the thing that they were trying to find. So JSON, and we could do a little, let me put this different line. Message. Let's just say invalid ID. Cool. And I think the requirements for your homework will tell you what exact error message it expects to get back. In some ways, that's kind of not the most important part of this. In other ways, in not too long, your job will be to follow very specific and seemingly arbitrary requirements by a requirements team. So it might be a good time to practice. All right, 404. So, okay, so let's go back here. I've just kind of thrown in some pseudocode. How are we going to send back the user? Right now, we don't have access to the user. We need a user object to send back. Okay, seemingly good suggestion, find by ID, except why won't this work? We'd have to do it before we removed it, right? This is kind of the classic delete debacle, which is that we would actually have to do it before we removed it. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to find it. So I am going to, because I want to make sure we get to everything, I'm going to kind of cheat here, and I will actually just do res.json and send back the count. I know I'm terrible. Or we could, the ID might be, I'll just send back message. There we go. So not ideal. I'll put a little note in here that says, but I will leave that up to you guys on the homework too. Yes, don't watch. I will leave that up to you guys to figure out what this looks like exactly on the homework. We can come back and do it at the end if there's a little more time, but I want to spend plenty of time on our put request. So I'm going to slightly cheat here. All right. So we have, I mean, this is a fine endpoint. It doesn't match the requirements, but this is totally acceptable code in terms of creating a working delete. Let's make sure it works though. All right, Postman, come on. Who should we delete? Let's start by getting. Let's see who our cast of characters are. So we have like 8 Charleses and then Fenny the Ferret and our 2 defaults. Who do we want to eradicate? One of the 99 okay. We are in no short. Should we get rid of Charles 3, 4, 5, or 6? It matters. It only matters if you're a Charles. 6. All right, everyone, we have a consensus. Charles 6 is the one. All right, let's try it out. Uh-oh. Something went wrong. What went wrong? I actually, normally, sometimes when there's a problem, it's because I intentionally created it. This time, I actually don't know. So let's do some, I see a little note that the README is actually, does not specifically say to return the user. I might have gotten that one wrong. Thought it did, but let's see. No, I guess it doesn't say. All right. Never mind. My shortcut was actually semi-justified. All right. So, but let's do some debugging. So I think a great starting point would be, let's make sure our ID is what we think it is. So let's try it out. Whoa. Okay, I don't think this had fully. What's going on here? Console is not a fun. Oh, I know how to write JavaScript. All right, let's try that again. It's okay. I normally go to bed at like 9 p.m. I'm adjusting to this new schedule. That's my excuse. All right, let's try that again with a real console log. Okay. And that's weird. It just worked that time. Maybe I hadn't saved. It's very possible that I hadn't saved. Coffee fixes everything. That's okay. Two fun facts about me. One is that I actually own a coffee shop. The other fun fact is that I actually have an extreme caffeine sensitivity, and I will like get the shakes and like have panic attacks if I have too much caffeine. So I'm like the world's worst coffee shop owner. I just drink tea and decaf espresso all the time. But yeah, so if you guys, apart from learning how to build servers, if you have any questions about what it's like to open and run a coffee shop, I can also answer those. I think I'm better at this point, at least. It just opened a few months ago. At this point, I think I'm better at building servers than running coffee shops, but don't tell anyone. All right, so enough with coffee shops. Let's move on and teach us how to make a latte. My latte art is pretty spotty. I can make a pretty tasty latte, but my latte art still could use some love. Maybe one of these days I'll like make them close down the shop early and teach my class from the shop and like do a latte art tutorial during break. All right, okay, so we're feeling good about our deletes. Let's make sure that it still works when we do. So now we know that 6 is missing. Let's just choose a like 78. We know there's no user 78. Let's try this one out. We get invalid ID, looks good. And then let's just confirm that Charles number 6 got deleted. So we'll do a little get request here. And there he is, missing. So Charles number 6 is gone. Charles number 99. I wonder if we could hack into the database and just assign an ID of 99. Will IDs ever be recycled? Generally not, unless you actually like had to wipe your database and start from scratch. Usually IDs will not be recycled. It'll just keep adding from whichever the last one was. I'm not going to mess around with trying to create a Charles 99. There are more important things we should be doing, like talking about ferrets. All right, so there's delete. It's looking good. Let's do put. So I'm actually going to have you guys do put. So first, we're going to spend a minute just talking about what the put should look like, some things that should happen in it. Puts are a little hairy. And then I'm going to set you guys loose for 10 minutes to work on it. And then after 10 minutes, we'll come back. I'll see what questions you have and we'll work through it together. So puts kind of require us to take everything we've learned so far and combine them into one request. So I will say we start by doing server.puts. Our endpoint is going to be API users ID. And then rec and res. So we will need, all right, let's go down here. Okay, so there's kind of a few different options here. The first one is that we successfully update. And I'm trying to think what status code it actually wants for this. Let's ask the docs. Okay, so it wants, so in the docs, we can see that there are actually these kind of 4 different options. There's a 404, a 400, a 500, and a 200. So I know I just kind of rushed through that. I'll break those down over here. So 200 is going to mean successfully updated. And we should send back our updated user. 400, that's bad request. So 400 is going to happen when some stuff is missing from our body. So once again, we need name or bio we need both. So if either of those are missing, just like with a post, we're not going to put. Next option is 404, which is going to be an invalid ID. And then the last is our catch-all. So you see what I mean about we're taking all these things we've been working on and kind of combining them together. So in this case, there are actually 4 possible outcomes. So it's a little trickier. So I'm going to leave those outcomes up. I'm going to set the timer to 10 minutes and let you guys get on it. And I'll try not to ramble too much about cappuccinos or ferrets so that you can pay attention and work on this. No, no, not. How do I watch a programmer try and do something simple? What in the, whatever. Just do 10 minutes. It's probably really simple. Okay. And go. And to answer the question about if the README doesn't specify what the delete should return, yeah, you guys can use your judgment. And you'll find as you move on through the section that the requirements will get more and more vague. And that's because we're starting to assume that you guys can come up with reasonable responses. So requirements are pretty strict for this one, but you'll see them getting more and more open-ended. Nice. We got Charles 99. And here's the, I'm sorry, there's the code. Just going to do a quick poll to see where everyone's at. If people are feeling good, we can move on. If you want the couple more minutes on it, that's totally fine too. All right, it's looking like we're ready to go over it. So, and or the timer, 1 minute and 35 seconds early. All right. So, nothing we haven't seen already, but now we're just putting it all together. So the first thing we really want to check here is it's basically the lowest hanging fruit, which is the name or the bio missing? And the reason I say that that's low hanging fruit is because it's not going to require any sort of database request. We can check this without having to mess it all with our database. So, and of course, our name and bio, where is that coming from? It's obviously coming from the client, but where on, which means it's going to be somewhere on our rec object, but where on our rec object are we going to be able to ideally find these things? On the body, exactly. And I'll go ahead and save rec.body as the user for readability. So we can do a very similar if statement to what we did in post. So if user dot name and user dot bio, we want not boy, but like skater boy, spelled boy, bio. So we know that most of the code, most of this logic, this little piece will go on our else. The rest of this should go somewhere up in this if statement. There we go. Cool. So down here, we'll just send a response in this error code. Up here, what would be our next step? What is the next thing that we should probably check or try? db.update. So if we wanted to, we could independently check the ID, but I think that we can take care of it just within db.update. So let's go ahead and look at the docs for that method. So update, it's going to accept two arguments. We want the ID and then an object containing the changes. That seems to make sense. And this will return a count. So we don't actually have to check the ID independently because we can just rely on this count that update returns for us. So very similar to what we did with the delete that had the count, right? Yep. Cool. So we can do db.update. We're going to pass in the ID and the user. And once again, there's nothing set in stone saying that the update method would accept an ID and user in this order. That's just something we need to check in the docs, because you're going to see a lot of this very similar database methods in different servers, but the details will change. So make sure you're checking the docs or checking the code. And then .then, we know it's going to be a count because we just read that in the docs. And then .catch. Cool. So if we catch something here, this is kind of our, okay, something went wrong. We don't know what it is. We just know that something went wrong moment. And then we have these two other, man, my tapping is getting all sorts of crazy. Sure, there's an easier way to do this. All right, so how are we going to differentiate between these two remaining cases? rec.params.id. Oh, I forgot to pull the ID. Thank you. Good catch. Yep, so if we ran this right now, we would get ID not defined. Absolutely right that we would want ID equals okay. Rec.params. Cool. Good catch. Okay, so back here. So now that we actually have an ID to work with, how are we going to differentiate between these two cases? The one where we've successfully updated versus the one where we are like, hey, this ID isn't a real thing. Check count. Yep, so a very similar if statement. And we could always do, it might be clearer to say if count equals 1, but we can do a shorthand because of truthy and falsiness. And otherwise, cool. All right, so at this point, I've kind of just written out all the pseudocode. I'm mostly just need to send responses. There's one other thing I need to do in this if statement. So let's go through and replace these comments with real code. So there's one more step I have to do in this if statement. If I know that I've successfully updated my user, what do I need to do? Find by ID, exactly. Because remember, we want to send back our updated user. And that doesn't mean just grabbing this user object we already have. That means actually taking what's really in the database and sending it back. And the only way to guarantee that is by doing db.find by ID. We have an ID. Okay, and now we can send it back. Oops. Cool. Down here, pretty straightforward stuff, right? No, this was a 404. Oops. Touchy. I'm just like making up express methods. And I'd be like, oh, wouldn't it be nice if I had a message method? No. All right. JSON. At this point, it's mostly semantics. Oops. I'm just like hitting the wrong key on the keyboard. Oh no, it's just wrapping. That wasn't me. All right, it's down here. Pretty much just going to be lazy. And let's copy this one. All right, this is our kind of catch-all. Something went wrong, but we don't know what. And then finally, I can just steal it from somewhere up here. And if anyone's thinking it, maybe even someone's typed it already, we see that there are these kind of reoccurring status messages. And you could, to make this a little drier and cleaner, I would absolutely abstract out a function that you enter in a status and you enter in a message, and it just kind of automatically creates that. And oh yeah, you guys are, yep. So the reason I didn't do a status up here is because I want a status 200, and that's just going to be implied. All right, so that was a bit hairy. Any questions on this put request or on anything else we've seen so far? I'll give you guys a minute to catch up. Oh, actually what we should probably do is go ahead and make sure that to be like, oh yay, our code's wonderful. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Let's do some Postman stuff. Should we mess with Charles 99 now that he exists? Let's try it. Looks good. If I leave out his name, missing name or bio, let's try an ID that doesn't exist, invalid ID. And then let's just do a quick get request to make sure that he updated correctly. Yep, Charles has become Charlie. All right, I think you guys either get it or you're just silently being like, curse this put request stuff. We're almost at the end here. I'm gonna go over I'm gonna do things slightly out of order. I'm gonna actually go over the homework right now because the last topic, which is query strings, don't actually appear on the homework. So I'm going to go over the homework, which relates to everything we just did. I'll talk about query strings real quick, and then I want to mention one other thing, and we will be done for the night. Well, I'll be done for the night. You guys have to go do homework. I'm so evil. All right, let's talk about the rest of the homework. So here's the database file. Let's just go to. So you guys are already familiar with this repo. You've gotten at least halfway through. I know I heard from your PMs that some of you guys have already started messing with this stuff. It's very similar to what we went over tonight. You have to do a post, put, and delete request for these posts. So your resource is different. The schema is slightly different, but very similar type stuff. So be careful. Make sure that I don't know that there are any other database discrepancies like the array versus not array thing, but there could be, so make sure that your promises are resolving to what you think they are. Console logs, always a good way to check. So insert, or we already did insert. No, we didn't. Insert, update, remove. These are gonna be the database methods you need. As you've noticed, find by ID will also play into it. There'll be a bit of making sure that title and contents exists, but mostly just pay attention to this endpoint specification. This will tell you everything you need to know about what you're building. And it looks like it doesn't specifically say what the delete returns, so you can probably just return a message or the count there. That will save you some hassle. So yeah, that is the homework, really similar to what we just went over. And as I did with the first section, I will send you my code, but not until you've had a chance to mess around with this yourself. Last piece, if you're ahead, stretch problem. Just integrate some of the front end stuff you know with this. Create a basic React app and get them to talk to each other. Get your post to render. So it's always good. I mean, don't put too much pressure on yourself in general to do the stretch tasks if you're feeling behind. But I will say that I would try to do this at least once. I think that for the upcoming assignments, you'll see similar stretch problems. I think it would be good to try and get this up and running at least once so that you can start to see how the stuff we're learning now connects with the stuff that you have been learning. Okay, question. Can I briefly explain where you can find out how to create these endpoint in the docs? So the docs are the README on your homework. So if you go down to this endpoint specification section, this will tell you everything you need to know. So this is, it says the methods, the endpoints, and just a brief description. And then below there's specifications that tell you in more detail, like this needs title and contents. And if not, respond with a 400. And here's the error message. So it's all in the README on this repo. So that's where you can find that information. put code one more time? Sure thing. Before I take it away forever. All right, I want to move on to query strings, but yeah, don't screenshot. I mean, do what you want to do. It just you might not learn as much. Just saying. All right, let's move on to query strings. It's kind of a side note on this, but definitely related to what we're talking about. And I know a few of you asked about this at the beginning or mentioned it as an unknown. So query strings, we've all seen them. You know, when you copy over a URL and it's like this horrible thing. So what happened when I searched, so I went to google.com and it's this nice, clean URL, and then I searched status 201, and what happened up here? Can anyone tell me or guess at what happened up here in the search bar after I typed status 201 in? Or not in the search bar, I'm sorry, to the URL. I did make a GET request. Here's a question. What endpoint did I make a GET request to? Google is tracking our every move. That is true. Slightly unrelated to query strings. What endpoint did I make a GET request to when I searched this? /search. Awesome. That's totally right. So I made a GET request to the endpoint with /search. So what is all this nonsense that comes after /search? That is our query string. So think about a query string as, I know it came up like, what's the difference between a query string and a parameter? And that's a very good question to ask because they're similar. They're both ways of pulling some extra info out. So let's start by when would you want to use one versus the other and why are parameters good sometimes and query strings good other times? So, and you're absolutely right that this is actually, this awful string of text is a bunch of key value pairs. So let's look at params because we've already played with params. So parameters are good when you have one or two set defined variables. So we know that this thing is an ID. It's just an ID. It's not going to be anything else. And we could put multiple parameters in if we wanted, but you have to hard code them in a way and you have to specify what they are. So params are really nice when you want to be a little stricter about what you're expecting. But if you want to be more open-ended, a query string is going to be better. A query string is essentially the user's way of sending a bunch of key value pairs within a GET request. So let's create another little endpoint here. So we're going to do, server.get, and we'll just call this API queue for query users. So notice I'm not doing like any query string stuff. I'm just specifying this endpoint. You know, I could even, if we want to kind of mimic what Google does, we could just do search. Maybe that's even better. And then, of course, rec and res. Cool. And we're going to make it real simple here. So let's just make sure that this is working. Always a good place to start. So let's go to search. Uh-oh. Oh. There we go. Cool. All right, so what if we added these query key value pairs to the end? So before we get into that, let's talk about the syntax of this query string. And just to very quickly answer a question I see pop up. Question is difference between IID versus ID. So white space is completely ignored by the computer. So the only difference is readability. Ideally, there'd be some sort of style guide in a code base telling you which one it expects. I have a bad habit of mixing and matching, but from the code perspective, no difference between ID with the spaces and without. Just like no difference between what I had or throwing extra spaces in here. All right. So let's talk about the syntax of the query string. And we can kind of, I mean, the Google one's pretty awful, but we could start at the beginning. All right, we're just gonna pull a tiny part of this query string and break it down over here. Oops. Okay, so we see that we have our site and we have our endpoint search, and then we have a question mark. So the question mark is like a flag. It's saying, hey, there's a query string coming. And then after the query string, so we know that we have endpoint, question mark, and then following that, we have these pairs. So you can see that there are these ampersands, those separate the pairs. And then the equal signs are kind of like the colons in an object. So num is key, value is 30. And this is actually, and then source is HP. So let me actually show you something. We saw num is 30. So notice that that went away. Or maybe it's hidden somewhere else. Let's try this actually, sorry. Set it to 20 because I think 10 is default. I don't know where it went. It's probably somewhere in there. But anyways, I'm pretty sure that's what that num was referring to, is how many things are displayed per page. So this is a bunch of collections of key value pairs that are specifying information about my search for Google. And it's this nice way to send a larger chunk of data attached to a GET request. So let's play with it on our own. Now that we have somewhat of an idea of the syntax, we can play with it on our own search. So if we did, what's Postman? So if we did search question mark, and we could do keyword equals ferret, and then num equals, and notice that because Postman is smart, it's actually starting to fill these things in for us. Num equals 10, etc. And we could keep going. And then we send that. And something that's cool is that even though we put a bunch of stuff here, it still hit our endpoint, right? So it wasn't trying to find localhost 400 / search all this other stuff. It knew that the endpoint happens before this. So we're still hitting our endpoint successfully and we're still getting searching. So the last piece of this query string puzzle, and it is way less tedious to actually type them in directly if you're using Postman, by the way, but it's kind of fun to do this crazy syntax. The last piece is actually how do we pull them out? So ideally, our server would not just be uniformly sending back the word searching. We probably want to use these queries. So any ideas where we're going to find the contents of our query string in here? If we wanted to log them or return them or do something with them. All right, rec.query. So we can be pretty well assured that they're going to be on rec, right? If they're coming from the client, they're going to be on rec. And it turns out that rec.query is in fact where we want to look. So let's just start by console logging rec.query and seeing what we get. Cool, let's send it. Nice. So we see that query, in fact, so if we wanted to do something like, is it count or num? Oops. It's getting to the end of the night. So if we wanted to put these somehow on our response, we could if we wanted. Uh-oh, what'd I do? Oh, dot keyword. I got this. I got this. Something is still going wrong. What have I done? Who's more awake than me? I don't know. Something's going wrong. Have I saved? I think so. Oh, I think the string interpolation might not be ideal for inside of send. Let's try this. String. Nope. Oh well. I'm sure I'll figure out what it is right after I like walk away tonight. But either way, what I'm trying to do here, you could do send as well. What I'm trying to do here is actually kind of not ideal. And the reason for that, let's just go back to back. Okay. No, it's still not working now. There we go. Okay. So hard coding something in like that, even though I couldn't get it to work, is actually not ideal. And the reason is because you wouldn't want to assume that there was a num or a keyword. That's the whole point of the query string, is you don't know which ones are going to be there and which one aren't. So what you would normally see is actually something more like if rec.query.keyword, let's do something with it, otherwise yada, yada, yada. And at this point, I'm kind of just half pseudocoding because it's 9 o'clock and I want to let you guys go. / my brain is starting to be like, we're done teaching. I'll mess around with that and figure out what was going wrong there. The question about how are query strings coming to us, somewhere along the way, somewhere in Express's code, it's looking at the endpoints and saying, okay, if I see a question mark at the end of my endpoints, I'm going to assume that means a query string is about to start. So that means I'm going to pull the info out of it, do parsing different than the JSON parsing, but go ahead and put that on rec.query and then hit the endpoint of whatever came before the question mark. So short answer is that part's taken care of for you. Longer answer is that Express has built into it somewhere the capability to do that so that you don't have to. What is the use of query strings? It's for attaching slightly more chaotic data to a GET request. The kind of classic example would be in some sort of search. Like it's Google's way of saying every Google search goes through this /search endpoint, but every Google search is going to be very different. So even though when I search for status 201, or when I search for like ferrets creating servers, and then you go home and you search for why won't my code work, we're all hitting the same endpoint. Every single Google search hits the same endpoint, but extremely different things happen when I search one thing versus you search another thing. And that's because the behavior of the search is totally dependent on these series of keys, of key value pairs that are attached to the query string. So it's a way for the same endpoint to behave differently based on different factors, like what have I typed in to the Google bar? What are my settings? What computer am I using? Where's my location? What language am I in? These are all data that are going to be passed on to Google's API via this query string. Can we use a query string for doing selections to a database? You shouldn't be able to. If it's a poorly written API, you could maybe hack the database using a query string, but those are totally different worlds. The whole idea behind an API layer is that the client does not have access to your database. The client really should not be able to be writing any sort of SQL code. The idea is that, you know, on the database level, you can write SQL code to do whatever you want. But the reason that there's a db.js is it's the idea of these are the only things we want to be done to the database. And not only that, but we're actually going to regulate them via the API layer. So the whole point of having an API layer is to prevent people from being able to directly query your database. So even though it's the same word, query, totally different worlds. As far as will we eventually write everything in here ourselves? Yep. So, and not even in that long, in a couple of weeks we'll do it. I think our last week before Christmas break is going to be this. It's not as bad as it looks though, because I mean, you might someday write it completely from scratch, but this connects library actually builds in. And if some of you guys don't have any database experience and what I'm saying sounds like nonsense, that's totally fine. It'll make sense in a couple weeks. But for those of you who are familiar with basic SQL, connects, and there are other languages like this, is essentially a pseudo SQL for JavaScript. So you can do things like DB users where this first, and that's a JavaScript version of saying, you know, I'd like to query the user database and select everything where ID equals this and return the first entry. So you'll be using existing kind of pseudo SQL libraries to create these basically models, to create these different methods that we can do on the DB. So this file that was given to you, in a couple weeks, you're going to be writing this sort of thing. All right, any other questions? Insert Linkin Park. No Linkin Parks. No Linkin Parks. No Linkin Park songs. That's the ultimate hack. You just hack everyone's computer so it just plays Linkin Park songs all the time. And we'll all be so moody and introspective. Okay, we're talking about Linkin Park. It is time. It is time to be done for the night. All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I think we did a good job of building off of this basis that you guys developed on Tuesday. So now not only can you build a server using Express, you can build a full CRUD server for create, read, update, destroy. So that is really the core of it. You're starting to see more and more where these complexities can arise. And I'm sure you guys can imagine that we just did CRUD operations for one resource. So I'm sure you can imagine how this does start to get a little complicated when you're trying to manage 10 resources or even just 3 or 4 resources. But don't worry, we'll talk about that more next week. So I'm going to go ahead and let you guys go. You can work on the homework tonight. It'll be very similar to what we went over today. I would say just make sure you remember to test everything in Postman, console log. Don't make assumptions about what your promises resolve to. Read the docs and console log values, and you'll be good to go. As always, please ask questions in Slack, talk to each other, reach out to your PMs, and if you have any feedback, for me, you're always welcome to tell your PMs or reach out to me directly. Though I would prefer that you don't go straight to me if you have questions. If no one else can answer your questions, though, I am available if you guys need me. So I'll be kind of around on and off on Slack, and I will see you guys next week on Monday for our next lecture, where we'll talk more about middleware. All right, good night, you guys.